I just wanted to first say thanks to Leo and the Albert Schenker Institute for inviting me in particular, and Labor Notes specifically as well, to be part of this discussion. At least a half a dozen folks have come up to me since I've been here and both mentioned their surprise and their encouragement that we're talking. Some cynics say desperate times call for desperate measures, but I'm just glad we're in the conversation. Labor Notes, some of you know, has been accused sometimes of throwing bombs. I got a text from my mother today. We're from North Carolina, so she encouraged me to be on my best behavior. I will try. What I want to do is first point out, I think over the day I've been really struck by how much commonality and agreement there is in the room on the need for the labor movement to really be a movement, to try and build a movement beyond just the workplace. And something much broader than unions, building with our community alliances and our partners out there in the rest of the world. We also agree we need to go well beyond our traditional jurisdictions, embrace non-traditional worker organizations, and need to experiment. So I want to focus in my time, my 11 minutes that I've got left here, on some places where we maybe don't agree, or at least places I think after today we need to kind of clarify. And I'm going to divide it into the what we need to do, the old left program question, if you will, and how we're going to do it, the new left process questions. So stick with me for a little bit. In terms of what we do, just to clarify, I think it didn't get said enough. This is a fight for power. Our movement is about building power for working people, and that means taking power away from people that have it. When we do classes at Labor Notes at our conferences about power, we're pretty clear. There's two kinds. There's organized money and organized people. We've got a lot of potential power in our movement for being organized people, but as we'll talk about in a minute, we're certainly far from that frontier of our potential. Second thing that I think we have to be a lot clearer on is our need as a movement to be raising expectations. We live in the richest country in the history of humankind. How is it that we can talk about having a pension and 4 weeks paid vacation, and that's too much, right? We can't afford that. Somehow the companies like Walmart can't even afford to pay $12, $15 an hour. This is about trying to aim higher and raise people's expectations, and our movement needs to be all about that. And I think to do that, we need to be we're trying to create a common sense. Karen Nussbaum was talking about class consciousness, and there was a little discussion about that earlier. I like to call it common sense, and I think just to pick up on what Rich said, the way we're going to do that primarily and best is through direct action. 1946, as he mentioned, there were 10% of the workforce that was on strike. That created a hell of a lot of common sense among people about what we were doing and where we were going as a country. What hasn't been said enough, and I think needs to get said some more, and we need to discuss and debate, is we need to break some rules. The labor laws that we have are set to, they're designed to make us fail. And if we're going to change them, I think it's going to involve a hell of a lot more breaking of the rules as they exist. And so I'd like to talk some more about when and how we're going to be doing that. We talked a bit about it today too, but I want to sharpen this question about the role of the public sector and public sector unions. I come out of the public sector, and I can tell you for most of my time as a union activist and as a local leader, my statewide leadership and to some extent my national leadership was terrified of the public. We would do everything and anything we could to stay out of the spotlight, to keep our bargaining completely hidden in the dark, to keep the citizens of the state of Massachusetts, where I was a public sector worker, completely in the dark about what we were doing. And I think that was a hellacious mistake, and I think it set us as the teachers union in the state up for a lot of the wrath that we've gotten and that Mary Catherine was talking about. So I'd like to, I think that those are some of the things that we need to be thinking about and sharpening in terms of our program, but I think actually the program piece is really where we have more agreement than less in the room. And so I want to talk a little bit more about the process piece and how we do it. Before I go to that, I wanted to say, I wanted to give props in some unlikely places, at least for some of you in the room. You may think it unlikely for me to say this, but I think that one of the things that we've seen inside of the labor movement in various quarters is the recognition that if we're going to create a common sense among working people, given the low numbers of, the low union density that we have, we've really got to actually do a lot more to try and sow the seeds for a movement, whether it's SEIU embracing the fight for a fair economy or the work that inside the CWA they've been doing to try and promote a kind of internal discussion and program on the need for a democracy movement in America. These are unions that are kind of grappling with the question of how do we create the sea in this country in which these ideas that we're talking about here in the room today can actually swim in, and how do we plant the seeds for a future movement. So I wanted to say, I think we're doing some of that work right, but there's also some big questions that are open there about how we do it that I think relate to how we do our day-to-day work as a union movement. And I want to sharpen some of that. So I was really excited this morning to hear the vice president of the AFL-CIO sit up here and say that in his opinion we can't do anything that we're talking about here without having the members at the center of that. I was like, hells yes, this is great. I'm in the right place. So I couldn't agree more with what he's saying. I think we got to define that a little bit and get into it a little bit more. Because as Karen Nussbaum on the same panel raised, she said, this raises the question of democracy. And I agree with her, but I want to sharpen both those a little bit more. And with all due respect to Paul Booth and his contribution on the urgency of the need to organize the unorganized, I'm going to say our first and most important and most urgent task is to organize the already organized. We got 13 million members in our movement. This is our strongest resource. This is our best hope. And we ignore it every day at our peril. I was taught that we want one steward for every 10 members in our shops, right? That's 1.3 million cadre that we need to build. Last I checked, there's no union in this country that is actually there yet. So I really want to encourage us to be thinking hard about how we're going to actually go back and do that. And I think to do it actually means we have to do some things pretty dramatically different than we've been doing them. First, as I said, I think we need to tackle this question that Karen Nussbaum raised about democracy, because it's not just about paying dues and having a vote. It's actually about members in an authentic way really leading the organizations that they're a part of, meaning developing the strategies, making the plans. We at Labor Notes wrote a book trying to outline how this looks called Democracy is Power. I can't go into all of that. But I think a friend of mine who is an activist in the teachers union in Los Angeles kind of captured it when he was saying we need to exponentially expand the number of members with the skills, the confidence, and the authority to go out and do things on behalf of the union. So that's sort of the mental picture I have in my mind. Like I said, though, I think we also have to contend with our practices, in particular, what staff and elected leaders do. Paul Booth brought up this question of the organizing model versus the servicing model, and I actually think that framework, that dichotomy, has really done us a disservice over the years. Because to me, I think that in point of fact, there's three nodes in the chain. There's servicing, there's mobilizing, and there's organizing. And at least servicing and mobilizing can be done top down and they can be done bottom up. But organizing, for me, is actually about self-activity. It's about workers organizing themselves and putting plans in motion and doing things on their own. And I think that this raises the question that I actually put on a card for Dan Schlederman about what's the role of staff and the infrastructure of the labor movement. What do we need to change if our goal is actually to create more self-activity of our members out there in the world? I think, unfortunately, we have a lot of institutional pessimism about what people are willing to do. And we talked a lot about the successes after the right-to-work sneak attack in Michigan for AFSCME and the AFT, but we didn't say a lot about Wisconsin, where both those unions and many, many others pretty much cut and run because they assumed, and maybe quite rightly, that in the short term at least they weren't going to be able to stick it out. But I want to offer up some examples from my experience working with unionists in Wisconsin that you can. In particular, I was just writing a story for Labor Notes about the Racine teachers, where 90% of the teachers in the city of Racine voted to reauthorize their union. And they had a majority after the first 5 days, but they kept working because they treated it like a new organizing campaign. They had call lists, they had one-on-one meetings with everybody. They just spent a lot of time working with each other, the way you should do in a well-organized workplace. Bob Muhlenkamp wrote an article a long time ago that many of you probably read called Organizing Never Stops. And I think this is the picture that we've got to kind of hold in our head. But if we're going to succeed in organizing the already organized, we got to meet them where they're at. And while I agree 1,000% with the sentiment of the discussion today that we live lives that are, 360 degrees, three-dimensional, we are not just our jobs, we live in community, we do spend 10, 12, 14 hours a day at work. And if the labor movement, that's the labor movement, can't actually meet people where they spend so much of their time in the workplace and make meaningful change for them in the workplace, I don't think we're going to get too far. And I think it's not really an either or, it's a both and. And the CTU strike, which we wrote a book about called How to Jumpstart Your Union, if you haven't read it, you damn well should. It is a great illustration of how they did just that. They were having a debate in the city of Chicago about the future public education for their town. They were talking about massive national education reform policies. But they were also fighting for the right to have books on the first day of class and to make sure that when it got over 85 degrees that there was air conditioning in every building. These are things that teachers cared about and they fought for. But they weren't disconnected from the bigger questions that animate many of us and that animated the strike. I'll also say that, I don't think we're going to inspire a lot of people to take risks if we can't actually demonstrate some kind of power on the job. And I know that's a controversial statement, but perhaps in this room, but I believe that it's true. So I don't believe that we've lost the power to do that. I wanted to say, we've talked a little bit about the strike off and on here. David Rolfe said that our power is the power to disrupt. So I wanted to add my firm endorsement for the fact that that's got to be a central piece of our strategy. And it can't just be symbolic power, right? It actually has to be about stopping economic activity, hurting companies in their pocketbooks. And in the best case, that looks like community and labor doing it together. I'm thinking about the 18-day bus driver strike in Burlington, Vermont, where riders and drivers were on the picket lines together, or the CTU strike. But even if you look at the Piston Automotive in Toledo or the berry pickers in Washington State, these are examples where people used old-fashioned tactics to do what needed to be done and actually succeeded. Now, to do any of this, to actually really connect with members where they're at, to tackle the issue of democracy, that means that we've got to embrace the question of politics. And I mean politics inside of our institutions, not just the Koch brothers and Alex of the world. We have to talk about how we run our organizations, how we make decisions, how we spend our money. And Karen Nussbaum said, this can turn into a hot mess sometimes, but I think the alternative is way worse. Unions at their very best are schools for democracy, or at least they can be, and without it, I don't think we're going to make much headway in changing our consciousness, which is so much a part of what we want to do. I'll just end with 2 points. One is, if you think about the CTU strike, which I said we've written a lot about, I don't think 4 years before they had their strike, you could have imagined the membership of the CTU having a discussion about the question of educational apartheid in the city of Chicago. But the leaders in that union were actually willing to trust that given the same facts, same analysis, and actually, having built the relationships that they built, that members in that local could get there. I've been in the labor movement for 20 years. I've never been more excited about where we're going. Our wing, Labor Notes, the troublemaking wing of the labor movement, as I like to call it, we've been growing by leaps and bounds, and I see a lot of potential. I think we've got a lot of work to do. Everyone here will acknowledge that, whether it's Mark Demonstein or Larry Hanley, you get elected, now what, right? Like the distance between your model and your muddle are pretty big. But I think that, I want to end with one last thought, which is, it struck me that we've been very comfortable in response to Ferguson with the way that this insurgent movement has challenged our traditional civil rights institutions and our traditional civil rights leaders, this young insurgent leadership emerging out of these movements. I'd like to see that same openness in the labor movement and inside of our own organizations. So, that's what Labor Notes has been doing for 35 years. We're going to keep doing it. I'm glad that we're now here at the Albert Shanker Institute. We'll see what we can do. Thank you.